Do you know what an REO is?
An Oreo?
No, not an Oreo. An REO. REO.
Real estate?
What's the O stand for?
E, organization?
Owned. Real estate owned. That's what happens when a property goes to foreclosure. We call it an REO.
Joining us now, Congresswoman Katie Porter, Democrat from California. Congresswoman Porter, thank you very much for joining us, and I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And I want to just begin with a note about your style, your question style, as opposed to content at the moment in hearings, because we've now seen an awful lot of indignation and moral indignation and understandable anger and outrage voiced in impeachment inquiry hearings on both sides, actually. And what I'm struck by in your questioning style is that you are always flawlessly polite. You never try to use volume to create an emotional effect in your questions. How did you arrive at this style of questioning that you use in the hearings?
Well, before I ran for Congress, I was a law professor, and so I had hours and hours of classroom experience asking students questions, trying to draw them into engaging the material. And frankly, some of those students were incredibly well prepared, and some of them were not. And so I guess I give a shout out to all those students who didn't quite get the homework done for giving me a lot of preparation for dealing with some of these corporate CEOs and Trump administration officials who show up in Congress not ready to talk about the issues of the day.
And the one that kind of was your first big hit was Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan Chase CEO. And when we saw that video, we ran it on this show and immediately asked you to come on. And I just want to show one more piece of this because it involves kind of a little math question that he just couldn't figure out. Let's watch this.
Mr. Dimon, you know how to spend $31 million a year in salary, and you can't figure out how to make up a $567 a month shortfall. This is a budget problem you cannot solve.
And Congressman, what's so striking about that, I think we both know, is that if you were showing him a budget problem in a business where there was a shortfall, one of the things he would suggest is ways to raise the revenue going into that business. It never occurred to him in talking to you that one solution to the problem of someone working at his bank at the low wages that you identified would have been for him to raise the pay of that person.
And to be fair, I don't know if that occurred to him and he simply wasn't willing to admit it. Some of his competitor banks, including Bank of America, had just announced pay raises of up to $20 an hour. And the hypothetical example I gave him, the single mom working at JP Morgan Chase was earning $16.50. So I don't know if it crossed his mind and he simply didn't want to admit it, or if it didn't even occur to him that the most obvious way to help a family make ends meet is to give them a share of the wages and the value of the company that they're help creating.
One of the things we clearly see that you do that most people in your position have not done in the past is look at the statements that a corporation makes in court through its corporate lawyers versus what that same corporation says in advertising or what that very same corporation says in testimony before you. Were you surprised that that was kind of a technique available to you that had not really been used by the Congress before?
Well, I think it really takes some preparation to do that. You have to dig into what the corporation has been saying, what it's saying on its calls with its investors or its shareholders. What is it saying in cocktail parties, sort of behind closed doors? What is it saying, sort of in other contexts? And then ask yourselves, why should they be able to go into federal court, for example, and say one thing, and then come to Congress and say something else? We're supposed to be searching for the truth. We're supposed to be getting answers for the American people. And so all I'm really asking these corporations or administration officials to do is to be honest about what it is that they're doing, to be honest about what it is they're trying to do, because then the American people can decide if this is a conduct that we should be addressing or not.
Speaker Pelosi has mentioned the hundreds of bills, I believe 275 bills that with bipartisan votes of the House that have been sent to the Senate and ignored, blocked by Senator Mitch McConnell. You have your own legislative agenda in the House. What have you been able to accomplish with that?
About half of my bills are also bipartisan, so I think that my work is very consistent with that of the Democratic caucus. I have a bill on mental health parity, trying to enforce access to mental health care. That's a very important issue. We have a bill to help workers keep more of what they earn to be able to pay for the costs of child care. As the first single mom of young kids to ever serve in the U.S. Congress, I'm acutely aware of how difficult it is to pay for child care while you're trying to do your job and make ends meet. So I'm excited about these bills, but we've passed a lot of great bills that are sitting there, as you mentioned, in the Senate. I had a town hall recently, my 12th town hall of the year, and I actually took the time to go through with my constituents and list some of those bipartisan bills. And I think the constituents were very, very surprised that there's hundreds and hundreds of bipartisan bills that have been passed by the House of Representatives.
What has been the biggest surprise for you now at the end of your first year as a member of Congress in adjusting to this new occupation?
Well, I think Congress has a lot of traditions, a lot of rituals almost, sort of its own rhythm. And you know this from having worked on the Hill. And I think some of those traditions serve us well. And I think some of those rhythms and kinds of ways of doing things really are just a legacy of the past. And if we're going to continue to diversify the voices that we hear in Congress, if we're going to work to create a Congress that really reflects the experiences of the American people, we're going to have to be willing to revisit some of those traditions. I think my class came to Washington really committed to making sure that we were listening to folks back home, making sure that we were doing town halls. And so I think one of the things that we could do going forward is really think about how many days should we be spending in Washington versus days spending with our communities. I personally feel like I learn more when I'm with my community, and I get to hear those voices, and that's where the education those are really where the issues come from that I take with me to Washington. Congresswoman Katie Porter, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and thank you for joining us throughout the year as you have done. Absolutely. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. Thank you to Katie Porter and your family.